imagine we're ready, gentlemen. We had a great conversation, at least a warm-up behind the scenes. I have to start off by, I'm a Texan, with a bit of honesty here. I wanted to bring out my tablet or my smartphone, for obvious reasons, to have my questions and the comments there. But I was afraid that my tablet would lock up in the presence of Bill Gates, and I don't think I could live past that. So as a result, my notes, Mr. Gates and President Clinton, look a little bit like a second-grade art project, but my mother assures me she's going to place them on the refrigerator, because this, of course, is history. I want to start out with the conversation, picking up a bit on Juan's presentation. I was so struck by his comment that the fiscal debate is taking up all of the oxygen in the room. Juan believes we're not able to look at trends ahead because we're mired or being pulled down by this ongoing conversation that seems easily resolved with compromise. Mr. President, I'll give you the first stab at that.
Well, it's self-evidently true. But the problem is that the nature of the debate goes to one factual dispute and the core of the political differences between the two parties in Washington today. That is I'll tell you what I think first. I think everybody in this debate has an obligation to say what they believe. I think Paul Krugman's right in the short run, and Pete Peterson and Simpson Bowles and all those guys, everybody's right in the long run. And the question is timing. If you don't kick a long-term debt reduction plan in at the right time and we don't pass a plan in advance, then there's always the chance that the economy will start recovering and interest rates will go through the roof, and it'll make this sequester look like a Sunday afternoon walk in the park. I mean, don't forget, if interest rates today were what they were when I was president, when they were pretty low considering we had growth, annual payments would go from somewhere in the range of whatever they were this year, between $250 and $300 billion to $650. So we need to deal with this. Secondly, because of the debate, because it's stale, it's taken up all the oxygen. But I think that a lot of cuts have already been made in the short run, and the president's offered a long-term plan that even basically reflected apparently the private understanding he had with John Boehner when they were negotiating. And I think that the best thing to do, and Simpson Bowles has done an update, which I just read, which I think is, pretty good, and they need to, the Simpson Bowles update says we shouldn't kick any more real restrictions in until 2016 so the economy keeps growing well. It's obvious that the defense cuts and a general restriction on the public employment have, in the near term, slowed the recovery. It's obvious that if you overdo austerity early, you get Europe, where their unemployment rate exceeds 12% now. But we need to go ahead and pass a long-term plan and get this off the plate. We're not debating anything about the future now. And if you look at the fix that was done for airline passengers, which, since I have to trundle back and forth between here and New York all the time, I appreciate it. It basically is a metaphor, a mini metaphor, for the choices made in the sequester, where 44% of the cuts were from domestic discretionary spending, which is 15% of the budget, 38% of the cuts from defense, 4% from the health care and other entitlement programs. And it basically, within the budget of the FAA, we're making it possible for us to, all of us, to fly with fewer delays and not investing in improving the infrastructure of regional airports. And that's basically the constant choice we keep making. If we just kick the can down the road, we choose the present over the future. That's what I think. So I agree with that. I think if we could get this agreement made, it would lift a huge burden, it would increase confidence, and they could actually go out and debate something that's worth debating. But if you try to do, which I support, tax reform and the whole thing, and you have to relitigate the whole debate about whether there will be any more revenues, I don't see how they're going to get an agreement, and we'll just keep spinning our wheels here.
And if we continue to spin the wheel, we remain stifled, and that brings to mind, of course, innovation, Mr. Gates. When you see what's happening, you're not in, as they refer to it in D.C., in the sausage-making business, but you're certainly in the innovation and technology. And when it boils down to what we can afford, and we're so focused on these immediate concerns from the FAA to, if you will, the small pieces of the equation, how do we think big and how do we invest big in America's future?
Well, people say that the auction's being taken up by the debate. It's kind of strange to me that the healthcare cost problem, which really is the long-term problem, you have some in terms of retirement obligations because of the age structure change, but overwhelmingly it's the healthcare cost, which fortunately OMB and CBO actually take the trends and are honest about, hey, that's going faster than the economy, and all you need is a little bit of time before that overwhelms your revenue-raising capability. So it's interesting that the amount of discussion about how you bend the curve on that really isn't there. And in fact, it's not a partisan issue. You know, the partisan issue is, okay, given whatever the cost is going to be, should the government bear the cost? Should the individuals bear the cost? And that's fine, but it's definitely a zero-sum discussion of shifting it back and forth. The real question for our country is, do we stay so much more expensive and on a trend line to eat everything else up? And I'm very disappointed that the degree of conversation about how you take innovation, how you take measurement and use it to improve that system, it's really not taking place. I mean, you know, who's your favorite person in terms of this? Where's your favorite panel? Even these budget deficit efforts, Simpson-Bowles and the others, which are fantastic, they're not health experts, and so they kind of hand wave the, oh yeah, by the way, you've got to get rid of that infinite growth piece in there somewhere at some point. So I wish, you know, technocratically or in some way we were having that discussion. This is a case where innovation can either be your enemy because it's inventing complex things like organ replacement, joint replacement, or it can be your friend where it's taking on things like chronic care costs, say getting rid of Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or diabetes, where you'd actually have cost savings. So, you know, we need to bring in a discussion about how we incent the innovation and how we get the efficiencies driven by measurement of quality that's simply not in the system today.
Mr. President, how do we get policymakers to think that I was at the final space shuttle launch, Atlantis, at Kennedy Space Center, and I literally was moved to tears thinking about this country and how we think big. If innovation is not accepted or understood by our policymakers, how do we look for America's next big thinking opportunity, our next big thing, so the next generations can feel as many of you did in the 60s and 70s and as I did at the Kennedy Space Center that day?
Well, I'll give you a very short answer to that, and then I'd like to amplify on something Bill said, because that's the whole debate. Yeah. We are continuing to innovate. There's a stunning amount of advance in human genome research and application. There's in nanotechnology and lots of other things. We need to do more, and one of the things that one of the few areas that I clearly disagree with the Simpson-Bowles report on is that I think any tax reform should not get rid of the research and development tax credit, because we're already less generous than about 15 other countries, and we don't need to do that. So we are continuing to innovate. We're not continuing to invest that in the future, but they're on the public side as much as we should. Here's the problem with what Bill said. I think about this all the time. This whole debate, this healthcare debate, has been shoehorned into the budget debate, as Bill described. And clearly, it's crazy for us to pay now 17.9% of GDP for healthcare, and no other big rich country pays more than 11.8. That's France. Germany's about 11.5. The only two rich countries that pay more than we are the Netherlands and Switzerland at 12. So that translates into about $1 trillion a year, 43% of which comes from the public sector. So the people who say, well, we've got to privatize Medicare or, voucher, or whatever they want to do, or and the people who say we have to project and keep in these phenomenal cost increases to account for both this medical inflation and the delivery system, as well as the baby boomers getting into the system, are accepting something that's unacceptable. On the other hand, this is the dilemma. If you could figure out how to solve this, we could make a budget deal, I think. We really need about 5 years to see whether the drivers in the health care law, which clearly are trying to give incentives for people to be healthier and incentives for the system to deliver health care where you pay for results, not by procedure, to see if that works. The problem is neither the Office of Management and Budget nor the Congressional Budget Office will score it. They want us to score this and do all this healthcare stuff based on what is a realistic projection of increasing healthcare costs if you keep the insurance system, the delivery system, and our lifestyles exactly as they have been, and you project them out. We have to change all three of those things. And if you're not willing to do that, we're not going to get anywhere. Keep in mind, in 2009, when this economy was on its knees after the crash in '08, health insurance profits rose over 30%. When everybody was worried about keeping their job, holding on to their businesses, not losing their home, the engine ground on. And I just read last week that on average, if a person is readmitted to the hospital because of a problem with infections or something that happened in the first hospital stay, the profit margin on that person to the hospital goes up 300%, which should explain why the Geisinger system in eastern Pennsylvania, where the provider eats all the cost if they have to do that, is so successful in holding down costs. Why is the government still getting Medicaid drugs cheaper than Medicare drugs? There are 1,000 questions to be answered here, but that ultimately the dilemma is that we are assuming we're not going to change the delivery system, the financing system, or our personal behavior. And if we don't change all three of those things, we can't get our numbers down to where other countries are.
And Mr. Gates, you've traveled extensively, of course. You just had a trip to South Korea, and you're looking at the delivery system. Your focus with the Gates Foundation is vaccines, polio. We talked a little bit about it behind the scenes. When you look at this domestic debate on health care and what you're seeing abroad in your travels, what stands out most to you in the fact, again, that we're mired in the same debate, and there seems to be legitimate solutions there on the table to be discussed?
Well, in healthcare, you can really, there's big differences between the rich countries, the middle-income countries, and the low-income countries. The low-income countries, which is where our foundation focuses most of its efforts, that's the key missing thing there is to have great primary health care, where a mother before birth is counseled, first 30 days, the infant gets care, the vaccinations get delivered, some of the things like the HIV drugs, TB drugs, malaria bed nets get out. And actually there's very good progress in that. That progress is quite dependent on aid generosity, with all these budget deficits, not just in the US, but also in Europe, Japan, all the traditional donors. There's a real question of whether the aid budgets will even stay flat. Some countries have been cutting those, and so that really hurts low-income countries. The middle-income countries, like China, are just beginning to realize how tough the healthcare costs are, and they've got a lot of injustice because of what's not covered. And yet, in some ways, because they're more open-minded, they're trying different things. So there will be good examples that come out of those countries that even the rich country guys should look at. The idea of how to use online, what are the different job categories, how do you measure outcomes. There's a lot of vibrancy there as they deal with the problem. The high-income countries are all facing the same rate of increase, although we've managed to be at a starting point about 1.5 times worse than everyone else. I got pulled into the rich world health thing, not because it's a big foundation priority, but at the state budget level where you actually have to balance, or at least pretend to balance on a yearly basis, there's some very fraudulent accounting having to do with pensions that if they were in the private sector would be considered out and out fraud. But because they have to at least pretend to balance, it's education that starts to get hurt. And that's our big, for our foundation, that's our big domestic focus, is the quality of the education system. And ironically, in the last 15 years where a lot of additional money went in, we didn't improve quality. Now we've got in the next 15 years where at best, because of healthcare, we'll look at flat and potentially even down. Now we have to get the quality up and the affordability up during this thing. So it's a pretty daunting problem. But it's one of these things where, what is the long-term plan? How do we step back? The states, in a way, don't control enough to really change the medical picture. They're, the scale of their operations, what they're required to do because of the federal rules. The reform on this one probably has to come from the federal level.
One of the things we're going to have to deal with, I agree with that, is that the price of health insurance is normally approved by state regulators. And they very often aren't even expert in it, and they approve these increases. Now, the current law says that for small funds, 80% of a person's premium has to go into health care, only 20% to profits and promotion. And for big insured groups, it's 85%. And that's supposed to be enforced at the national level. It has played a role in the fact that we've had inflation at 4% now for 2 years, for the first time in 50 years. But it's impossible to say what's going to happen when all these new people are insured, and everyone assumes that they will include people, they'll all be in small funds, so they'll be 80%, not 85%, and that a lot of them will be older or sicker, and therefore that the premiums will have to at least start out higher. And so there's a lot of talk about that now. But I'm agreeing with Bill. I think the national, we are the only country in the world, first of all, let's start with this, the only advanced country in the world with an expensive system that doesn't have a national health care budget. If we had a budget, we could do what the Republicans want. We could privatize it all. In the Netherlands, for example, 100% of the people have private health insurance. There's no Medicare, there's no Medicaid, there's no veterans health system, there's no nothing. Everybody buys health insurance, and then they get a subsidy according to their income. And it's all individually owned. But they have a health budget, which is why they're at 12 and we're at 17.9. And every time anybody talked about that in the past, I have the scars to prove it, they were accused of rationing health care, which of course we do every day in America. So
You say that the healthcare debate is being shoehorned into the budget debate. One might also say that's happening as well with immigration reform. You recently said that you expect it to pass, but you also make the case that immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, will help improve the U.S. economy. You might also know that there was a report just out yesterday. Heritage Foundation says $6.3 trillion in new spending and entitlements, as well as social programs, will be sucked out of the American budget, if you will, if comprehensive immigration reform is passed. Obviously, your comment is that the U.S. economy will improve.
But I disagree with that. I mean, for one thing, it shows only the downside in the worst case downside scenario with none of the upside for immigrants. Think of everybody who ever came to this country as an immigrant and started a company or took a good job and built a family and became middle-class taxpayers and sent their kids to college. I mean, it's one side of the ledger and the worst-case scenario on one side of the ledger. I'm for immigration reform because we need to stay younger than our competitors. We're younger than Japan. We're younger than Europe. Ireland's the only country in Europe with median age younger than America. And it continues to give us diversity and contacts from the rest of the world, and I'm for it. There is some dispute about something Bill knows a lot more than I do about, which is whether I've always favored increasing these H-1B visas and getting more skilled workers in here. And everybody in high-tech fields tells me we need more. And now there's a little debate about it. It's people claiming they just want to hire people from overseas because they work for less money. I think it's clear that if you get more talented people in this country and you make them feel welcome to stay and you let them start businesses and do all these things, it'll strengthen us. We can handle more people in America, and we can't afford to be in a world where we're old. You want to counter some of these budget problems, have more young workers and taxpayers relative to the number of people that are no longer working and spending your health care money, privately or publicly.
Mr. Gates, a number of big names, as they say, in Silicon Valley, spending millions right now getting into the immigration debate, people who have been previously described as apolitical, if you will. Your name has been listed as someone involved in, you can tell me if this is truth or fact, I am the media, so sometimes we get it wrong. A lot of times we get it wrong. Shh. But the reality is that there's millions coming in to participate in this debate on immigration reform. How does that move us forward? Did President Clinton make the case that it's about recruiting the best and the brightest from other countries for engineering, science jobs? Again, back to the innovation.
Well, I think I'm glad to hear that I'm viewed as apolitical.
No,
no, seriously, it's not a positive label nowadays to be viewed as political. And I do think that, you know, thinking just about the technocratic facts of what's efficient, how things are measured, is in some ways the best contribution. Whether it's how to improve education or how to improve health care, how to make sure foreign aid is spent the right way. Yeah, I am one of the backers of activities around immigration. Immigration, it's always important to separate two pieces. One is the high skills piece, that is, of the people that we have come into the country, should some portion of that include the people who have computer science degrees, including people that we've given a subsidized education here in the United States. That is, if I'm a graduate student at UC Berkeley in computer science, I'm going to get a job for over $100,000 a year. The question is, should that job be in India and the other jobs created around the person there, or should it be in the United States? That's, you know, that person's going to get hired, I guarantee you, because we help provide them a great education. So the high skills piece, there's no doubt the economic benefits. You know, if you're careful about who's using it and how they're using it, which the compromise proposal has all of that. Then you have the broad immigration debate, where, again, the economic benefits, I think, are very clear. I'm less expert on this piece, but the idea that somebody's showing that as a net negative, that's very strange. We are the envy of the world, as the President said, because we have a growing population. When you get into what Italy and Russia and Japan are in with shrinking populations, that is very bad for investment. And the number of working people to the retired people, it's a very tough problem. So immigration has always been a huge sense of vibrancy and economic improvement. So, you know, I'm hopeful that we get the whole thing pushed through. And, you know, of all the issues, it seems to be the most likely that something will happen.
I'd just like to also point out that we need to stop being so arrogant in some of our rhetoric, like we're doing everybody a big favor. I did read the other day, and maybe just because I read it, like you said, doesn't make it so, but there was an article the other day that said that every year we had a demand for more or less 120,000 people with computer science degrees, and in the aggregate, on an undergraduate level, we were only producing 40,000. Those degrees. If that's true, why in God's name wouldn't you keep everybody here who wants to stay, who got an undergraduate or a graduate degree, and why wouldn't you have a visa program that wasn't a bureaucratic nightmare to fill the gap while we're trying to increase more young people in the STEM fields? One of the things that we did through the Clinton Global Initiative when President Obama said we need another 100,000 STEM teachers, we knew the government weren't going to have the money to do this at state and local level, so we got 24 partners, and we're going to fill about 30% of that gap through just a totally private commitment. But why wouldn't you do that? The other thing, we need to be careful here. One of the great good news stories in the world in the last 5 years is Mexico. which has followed Brazil in reducing income inequality. The president who just left, Calderon, is too famous for the drug wars on our borders and too little known for starting 140 tuition-free universities that produced, among other things, last year, 113,000 engineering graduates. And we have had no net in-migration from Mexico for the last 2 years. The dream of NAFTA is going to pay off. They're going to be our equal trading partner. We're going to work together to build up the Americas. They're getting all kinds of investment from Asia moving back here and in satellite areas like people are coming to the Caribbean now, all because we believed in the promise of a partnership with Mexico. We should be wanting these people here, not acting like they're all knocking down the doors to get here. A lot of those Mexican people who went home have better economic opportunities at home than here now. This is good for us. We should do this because it is both morally right and smart economics.
I want to switch to a Facebook question. People submitted questions to both of you. This first one, President Clinton, how does our current budget reflect our values and priorities? Where do we need to adjust? That's Terry Dungallen from Washington, D.C.
Well, we need a long-term plan to balance the budget that doesn't have so much restriction for the next 2 years that it slows the economic growth more than austerity already has. We need to, I think, I don't have any idea whether in the current climate this is fixable, but what Bill said about health care is true. And just loading people out of the public system into the private system, which is already more expensive than publicly funded health care, is not the answer. If we could figure out some way to score for 5 years a number we were going to spend and give us the opportunity first, give us 5 years to try to reform the system, and failing that, go back to the old meat cleaver approach, I think that would be important. The fundamental problem for me is that the budget spends too much money on the present and too little investment in the future. And it's all the things that Bill has found out and the great work the Gates Foundation's done on what works on education. And it's all this investment stuff. I spent $3 billion of your money to sequence the human genome. Now they're saving lives of children at the St. Jude's Hospital in Memphis for $5,000 a map. And it'll soon be $500. We spent, and by the way, we had bipartisan agreement to do that. We spent $500 million of your money to do the first federally funded research into nanotechnology. Now it's a whole new section of the economy. We have to keep spending money on the future, which includes also things that are more expensive, like modernizing the infrastructure.
And I want to talk about education and infrastructure, but I want to follow up, President Clinton. The Democratic National Convention, you famously said it is arithmetic, and that resonated with a lot of people. You talked about the president's plan. You said he's offered a reasonable plan, $4 trillion in debt reduction over a decade, with $2.5 trillion coming from for every $2.5 trillion in spending cuts. He raises $1 in new revenues. And you go on to talk about tightening controls on future spending. But here we are again, going back to Juan's remarks just a short time ago, of the oxygen, if you will, being taken out of the room, and we are back to the initial start of this conversation of how do we move it forward with specifics?
I don't know, because I think all the president can do is make his proposals and keep playing golf with Republicans. I mean, in other words, I'm not making fun of him. I think it's a good thing he did. In other words, you just have to keep trying to work on it, because the truth is that in the current climate, it's not possible to make the kind of individual agreements to put, you know, for the president to, the White House can't give things out the way they used to. Both these guys, their most important thing is never to raise taxes. And so they say, we already raised taxes, we're never going to do that again, and even in tax reform. So I think the only thing I think is that maybe he should go back to start talking about the details of tax reform. I also think that the White House should offer a corporate tax reform without getting all the individual things worked out. And they're worried about, I know exactly what they're worried about. They're worried about, they repealed the extraterritorial tax. that there'll be even more parking of money overseas in tax shelters. But there's a great deal, I think Bill would say this, there's a great deal of difference in the business operations that Microsoft might have in China or Indonesia or Europe or anywhere, and some transaction that is made to look like it occurred in the Cayman Islands when we all know good and well it didn't, except for tax purposes. So I think there are ways to sort through that, and I still wish they'd find some pieces of this puzzle they could do, like the tax reform piece.
Yeah, I think the question about does the budget reflect our values is a very good question, because as President Clinton said, what we've done in the sequester is cut non-defense discretionary spending disproportionately. You know, what does that mean? It means we cut the NIH budget. You know, so in the face of the opportunity of the medical revolution where others are spending more, in the face of the needs for innovations that cut these medical expense increases, we cut basic research. We cut the aid budget, where over the last decade, we have been exemplary in spending it better and making sure things like HIV medicines, that the U.S. took the lead in getting those things out there. And so unlike foreign aid, 20 years ago that was more about who are our Cold War friends, now it's about real human values. And so certainly the sequester, I don't think reflects our values. And there really will have to be a discussion about funding the future, how much of a priority that is. Because even before the sequester, under the Budget Control Act, the Congress had said, okay, the non-discretionary is going to come down quite a bit. And understanding what did that really mean, which programs in there, some of which I think are quite important, education, research, some of those foreign aid pieces, I think those do reflect who we are as a country. And so, until we can get into the long-term piece, the mandatory piece, we're going to be moving away from what I think our unique contribution is and what our values are.
And following up on our values, we know your work, both of you, with education, NBC, and this is not a plug for my company, Education Nation, a lot revealed about the desires for this country moving ahead. And I've always looked back at this quote from you, Mr. Gates, and you say, when I was a teenager, I was captivated by computers. And you went on to say, 30 years ago, my colleagues and I envisioned a computer on every desktop. That is not happening. Is that a reflection of our values? We have the passion and we want these things accessible. I did a Google Hangout chat yesterday with 8 teachers from the inner city. Obviously that technology would not have been available to us 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Nevertheless, the technology that you dreamt of is not available, I believe, and many believe, due to education still not being the priority that it needs to be in this country. And your foundation seems to mirror that thought.
Well, over the next 10 years, the two things that I think will be great in education, one is to get a personnel system that really gives teachers feedback so we can improve the average quality. And that actually is only about 3% of the payroll that needs to be invested. We need to do that well. Other countries do that. The second dream for education is the use of technology. And although we're at a fairly early stage, as you get rid of textbooks, as you get tablet PC type devices out there, as you get the best teachers online, as you get personalized learning, there's a lot of excitement that's shaping that in the right way. And we need to make sure it works for low income, middle income, and all different types of students. So still a lot of research put into it. There is a hope that during the next 15 years that education can improve a lot. It's the greatest source of inequity in the country today. And, I think most people accept now that the budgets aren't going to go up much because of healthcare costs. It's even a fight to make sure that's the case. But I think even in a flat budget era, if we go after the personnel system, if we go after the use of technology, we can be optimistic that we'll get back to the equality of opportunity that we try and stand for.
Mr. President, at the other end of the spectrum, the higher education, and you've recently made a lot of comments about the costs of college and the alternatives that need to be seriously discussed, whether they be online classes, but the amount of debt people are leaving college with and how it affects the economy is stunning.
Well, the delivery system, college costs have not gone up as much as healthcare, but they have gone up roughly twice the rate of inflation over the last 20 or 30 years. And for example, at the end of my term, we passed the biggest increase in financial aid since the GI Bill, and within 5 years, it was all gone in terms of its net impact to the beneficiaries. That is, price increases had caught up and swallowed it. So now we've got a new student loan law, and it's going to be swallowed. On the other hand, a college degree is still a pretty good deal. I mean, yes, not all college graduates are getting higher paying jobs as they were 20 years ago, and that won't happen again until the labor markets really tighten up. And yes, some of them don't get jobs, but the unemployment rate among college graduates is still way lower than it is in the population as a whole, so it's still a good investment. And I just think we need to, both in K through 12 and in the university, we need to consciously talk about this more. For example, how do you I personally think we had more technology and more access to sites like the Khan Academy, the dropout rate would go down. I think that if kids could learn in different ways and you could integrate different disciplines, like these A+ schools in North Carolina and Oklahoma and Louisiana, and we got a couple of them in my home state of Arkansas. They integrate the arts into teaching English and social studies and history and math, and without exception, the dropout rate goes down and the achievement levels equal or surpass the state average in the poorest schools. There are all these things we know that I think will free teachers up to do whole different functions in a way that will really help education. And then we got to decide, how do you credit them in K through 12? How do you credit these MOOCs, these massive online open courses in college? And how do you maintain the experience? College and university is not entirely for economics. You know, you do get something out of life, learning how to think and be exposed to different people and all that stuff that makes it worth life more interesting. But I think that technology will be a big piece of this, but we have to think about how we're going to do it and how we're going to integrate it and credit it. Bill knows 100 times more about this than I do, but that's what I think.
Well, everybody's just learning. We're at an early stage, and like you, I see very exciting examples of where it has strong possibilities. In the current form, it's mostly being used by the students who are doing well already. So the idea of how do we make sure we get it to the inner city kids, and there'll be some hybrid. It won't just all be online, but some online, like where you go and learn the math, the equivalent of the lecture. This is called flipping the classroom. You do that at home, and then you're just doing problem solving, grouping kids together according to where their personal level of knowledge is. That's very promising. Education is another thing where the entanglement of what's the role of the states, what's the role of the federal government, makes it very complicated. As the states have had budget problems, they've raised tuition at their institutions, they've withdrawn support, and the federal government, through more Pell money, more loan money, has basically had to help make up that equation. Now when you talk about, okay, what are best practices and how do you incent best practice? How do we measure the output? You have the same dilemma you have in healthcare, which is if you really understood output, then you wouldn't fund some people to do some procedures. Well, various universities are much, much better at providing the right type of education, giving people opportunity. And we're finally getting some of that data out about outcomes as opposed to just saying, okay, do they take in a very good student body? Technology has a lot of promise to make this a part of the economy that we bring efficiency to, but we have incentive challenges of how to drive that forward.
I want to get one more Facebook question in. It was posed to both of you, and it reads, I've read a handful of seemingly reasonable economists that believe the largest enticement for manufacturing in the near future will shift from cheap labor to cheap energy. What do you think? What are some other alternatives you see in our current energy problems? Mr. Gates, you've talked about raising the living standards of the world's poorest and some of the complexities that come along, which include cheaper energy or cheap energy.
Well, the energy situation in the U.S. is a very positive story. You know, everybody's excited about how low-cost natural gas means that our electricity prices and our energy independence looks very positive. Now, that in the medium to long term, that creates a huge problem in terms of CO2 emissions. How do you either do carbon capture on those systems or a carbon tax so that you solve that problem? Manufacturing, there's a tiny bit of a renaissance in the United States, and various people have written about it. But the reason why people care more about the energy cost than the labor cost is a lot of it's very automated, and so it's not creating as many blue-collar jobs as it would have in its previous incarnation. You know, that's just a fact, and that's partly why we've got to get more people with four-year degrees to match the demand in the economy. But, you know, the energy story is quite a positive thing.
Basically, every year, labor is a smaller percentage of overall manufacturing costs, and materials, energy, and transportation are larger percentages. So it shouldn't be surprising that since the American workforce is productive and basically now less expensive, for example, in many European workforces, and with the Chinese wages rising and everything, that we're getting a lot of American companies bringing production back home. And I think it's really important. It's another reason I think R&D is important too, because increasingly people want to do modern manufacturing where they have their research facilities. They want them close together, and it's an important part of the picture, and I think we ought to keep working on it. But I think that, if I could just say one thing about this energy thing, I think the natural gas boom is good. It's an important bridge fuel. The CO2 emissions for gas are half what they are for coal. And the U.S. has made the biggest gains in greenhouse gas reductions of any major economy in the last few years because primarily of shutting down coal plants and burning natural gas and becoming more efficient. On the other hand, as Bill points out, it still emits a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. I think we need basically a three-point strategy. We need to use the gas. We need to act. We still don't have a program that is comprehensive enough to suit me, that recognizes the study that was done year before last saying that we could buy ourselves 20 more years in slowing down climate change if we got rid of the more rapidly dispersing greenhouse gases in an aggressive way. That's, Hillary worked a lot on this in black carbon and trying to stop wood-burning stoves, for example, and charcoal-burning stoves. That's one. Methane is a huge one, which is basically urban garbage in agriculture. And our foundation works a lot on that. And then the best news that I've seen is the Chinese agreement recently to phase out hydrofluorocarbons, which are basically in room air conditioning units, according to the Montreal Protocol, and they can save a huge amount, something like 8 billion tons of CO2, the equivalent of 2 years of Europe's emission over the next 17 years. If we concentrated on those and then didn't give up on solar and wind where the price is dropping and used our aid programs to put solar and wind where it is now economical with no subsidies, it would make a big difference. I've been arguing that the U.S. should basically make the entire Caribbean energy independent with clean energy because they have the highest electric rates in the world. So all clean energy technologies are economical there today without subsidy. It would be good for the economy, be good for theirs and ours, and it would make a huge statement. So that's what I think should be done. But I think this gas thing's brought us some time and is bringing us some wealth, and we ought to make best use of it. But if we go to sleep and pretend like climate change is not happening, that's not the best use of it.
Well, we have about 25 more seconds to go. We've covered a wide range of things. There's an elephant in the room that I've got to address here, just quickly, so indulge me. Women, not a donkey, but we can say that. Women are clamoring at the edge of our seats, wondering what is next. We know that she's dynamic. Her leadership is unmatched. Her voice for women, the poor, families. So I have to ask it. Mr. Gates, when is Melinda jumping into politics?
Well,
I'm for her.
we're both very lucky to have amazing wives who keep us on track and do amazing work in their own right.
President.
And I don't think Melinda's going to run for president. She hasn't mentioned it to me.
I pivot to you, Mr. President.
Hillary hadn't mentioned it to me either. Look, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know this. That is the worst expenditure of our time. You know, she's taking a role in the foundation. She's writing books. She's having a little fun being a private citizen for the first time in 20 years. And she's, you know, that's fine, but we need to be worried about the work at hand. All of us do. So whoever the next president is has an easier set of choices before him or her to build America's future and to build a more peaceful, more prosperous world. And it's frustrating when I think we're majoring in the minors, either over the budget debate or going right back to politics as soon as the last election's over, instead of getting into the grimy details where the future of America will be written, how we resolve these details. I think I'll pander to Bill Gates a little bit since we work together and he has money and I don't. But the Gates Foundation, I think, may be the best foundation, not just now, ever. And part of it is they worry about big things with clarity, but they also get into the grimy details. This stuff has to work. All that really matters in the end is whether what you do turns your good intentions into real changes. And it obscures our capacity to do that and plays to our national tendency to attention deficit disorder when it comes to politics and public problems if we get off on politics too early and forget about the details.
Well, certainly we hope we stay in the future business and stay focused on innovation, and the topics that we discussed today will be followed out through the day, and the bright and bold ideas that we know are in this country can certainly be shined upon. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.